Okay. Hello? So we'll continue talking about For Good and Evil, The Impact of Taxes in A Course of Civilization by Charles Adams. This book and a few thoughts on it. He starts talking about the Romans now, and I find this an interesting place to sort of begin, right? So he says, in addition, the rich were subject to forced loans on top of their basic war tax. Finally, the tax had a refundable element to it. If there was booty from the war, it was used to refund the taxes paid. The war tax was progressive in a unique fashion. Luxuries such as jewels, expensive women's apparel, and fancy carriages were assessed at 10 times their actual value. Other items may have been assessed at 2 or 4 times their actual value. The war tax was a wealth tax assessed from a census taken every 5 years. It was the duty of every citizen to come forth and make a declaration of wealth. So he starts talking about here about a war tax, about a tax upon its citizens, which a government raises in order for defense. And this war tax, a tax on its citizens, is a one-time tax, is a tax for a great need, is a tax in order to protect the nation, right? It's not to change the nation. It's not to slowly shift some economic values. It is because we are at war. We are being attacked. Cicero expressed contempt for the tax, and he quotes Cicero here. When constant wars made the Roman treasury run short, our forefathers often used to levy a property tax. Every effort must be made to prevent a repetition of this. But if any government should find itself under the necessity of levying a tax on property, the utmost care has to be devoted to making it clear to the entire population that this simply has to be done because no alternative exists short of complete national collapse. So this is something to really think about when we assess taxes. It's one thing to assess taxes on income. It's one thing to assess taxes on luxuries. You know, that if you buy an expensive bottle of wine, you have to pay a large tax on that. If you make a lot of money, you have to pay a tax on that. You know, if you use the roads, you have to pay a tax on that. And these are, in many ways, taxes on use. You know, the tax on roads says you use the roads, you benefit from the roads, you have to pay for the roads. A tax on income says you have money coming in and your income is at a high level, so we're going to use some of that income and take it and use it for certain things like Medicare and Social Security and common defense. You know, the army defends the nation, and we need a tax of some sort. You know, for Medicare and Social Security, these are essentially insurance. If you end up really poor, if you lose all your money, hey, when you're old, Medicare will keep you alive. If you lose all your money when you're old, if you are scammed out of hundreds of thousands of dollars, well, Social Security will keep coming in, and you may be poor, but you will not end up penniless at 80 with no hope whatsoever of climbing up the economic ladder. You will at least have Social Security. So these make sense as an insurance on something you make, right? And in taxing income is a easier tax to make because it taxes at the source, right? When you pay money to someone, then you pay taxes on that. The employer has an incentive to say this. It has an incentive to tell the government that they are paying taxes someone, doing a payroll for someone, because otherwise the government's going to ask, hey, you took in, $5 million, you didn't pay any out for anything, so there was $5 million worth of income. You're going to pay tax on that. But if the store can say, it was $5 million worth of income, and then I paid out $4.5 million in wages, so I made $500,000. That was my actual profit here. Or I actually paid out more in wages and I invested more into the business than I got back. So I actually lost money on this. Don't tax me for $5 million when the business cost me $6 million to keep running. Sort of issues. So an income tax makes a bit of sense. Because you are the government is basically saying, we will force you to pay for insurance for your health and Social Security when you're elderly. We will allow you to deduct your payments from the income you make on the side of the employer. So it works. A problem arises, however, when we begin to tax property. When we begin to tax things people have. Because that's when you get to the, hey, your business owns a building, you got to pay property tax on that building. You as an individual own a house, you got to pay property tax on that house. And these are dangerous because the end result is theoretically to take property from you. If you do not pay your taxes, eventually the government will take this property from you. Or eventually there will be such a lien on the property that you make no profit from selling it. So you may as well not sell it. And then it just sits there. Right? If you're going to sell your house and end up with a $3,000 profit, why on earth would you do that? You just sit there and allow the liens, the fines to keep building and building until they overwhelm the worth of the house. And if the government doesn't collect those debts by forcibly taking your house and then selling the house, then you just never pay that, and the property tax would never be moved on. So the basic idea of a property tax is threatening to take money from you, to take property from you. And if you're rich, and we are, like I said, assessing jewels at 10 times their regular value, we're saying if you have enough money that you can afford to purchase diamond earrings, and not $200 diamond earrings, like, fancy $40,000 diamond earrings. I don't know how much diamond earrings cost, but you can get there's a difference between a $2,000 diamond ring and a $45,000 diamond ring, I'm sure. And when you assess those at a higher level, basically saying you have the ability to make luxuries, so you have the ability to give us funds. But of course, that may not actually be the case. You may be cash rich and cash poor and house rich. Yeah, house rich, cash poor. In this case, maybe you may own your house, but not have the cash, the money to pay a huge tax on the house. And in this case, what do you have to do? You have to sell the house, take some of those proceeds, pay the tax on the fact that you own the house, which you no longer own, and then presumably buy yourself another place to live, which is worth less than the house you already possess. And then you have to pay taxes on that too. So at some point, you run out of property because you keep taking loss after loss after loss. So you need an income. And this presumes that you have an income. This presumes that those who own a lot or those who own luxuries are capable of raising funds, which may be the case, and many times is the case, but it's not necessarily the case. And of course, because you always have people on the edge, people in the gray zone, where, like, say you aren't very rich, but you happened to inherit a ring from your grandmother, right? You happen to have your grandmother's wedding ring, and your grandmother had money, and it's a $30,000 diamond ring, and you don't need to sell it because you have enough money to live on. And you want to keep it for nostalgic reasons or to give to somebody someday. And then the tax man comes through and says, oh, you have a diamond ring. Well, we're assessing that diamond ring at 10 times its actual value. So it's $300,000 is added to the property you possess. And now the government is basically saying, give us money. You better sell that ring to give us the money from the tax that ring is worth. And the main problem with property taxes, as I see it, is property is the foundation of our system, our economic system. We live in private property capitalistic system, more or less, where I own things and those things are mine to do with as I will. If the government starts taking my things from me, then why am I existing here in society following the laws? If the government can't keep my house, my car, my books, my computers from being stolen, and the government can't retrieve them for me, then the government is doing what for me? To protect me in which way? Just my life. And then there's a cost for living, and I'm working all the time, and I don't own anything. I'm just a renter. I just turn into a peasant. I turn into a serf, even. And that is not a desirable life in any way. To simply be somebody's slave and forced to work for peanuts just barely to survive because you don't own anything. You end up as a slave if you are not able to own private property. A wage slave, perhaps, but it hardly makes a difference if you still need to eat. So if a government, which is supposed to protect property, comes in and takes your property from you, that is, taxes your property, with the threat of removing the ownership of that property from you and remanding it to the government, or remanding it to the government and then selling those items to other private citizens, thereby shifting your property to those who have the money to obtain it, which is its own issue, of course. Okay, so to return to track, if the government is taking your property, and the government is supposed to protect your property, then you end up in trouble, right? Because the government is taking your property to protect your property. The government says we are at war. The government says we are threatened, we are challenged. We have to spend all this money on nuclear deterrence and conventional forces, and we need a larger navy and a larger army and a larger air force and more and more and more guns to protect ourselves. Or you have a war on drugs. We need all these social services, a war on poverty. We need to redistribute wealth in order to help the least advantaged among us. And so on. And the government can always come up with, any organization, in fact, can always come up with a reason they need to take your stuff in order to help somebody. Because you still have stuff, right? And there are people out there who have no stuff. There are poor folk who have mental issues or emotional issues, folk who are old, folk who have been abandoned, folk who have been injured, folk in chronic pain, folk who need expensive medicine. There's always somebody in need because we do not live in a utopia. And there's always an argument to be made. Hey, you have something, you own something. You are actually one of the privileged few, and we're going to make you pay for that to better the society and the nation. But if you're doing that, then why am I for society and the nation? One of the major problems that can happen with the American healthcare system is they will help you if you have no money. The government will pay to a great extent for your medical care. And so you have old people who get cancer, or you have a middle-aged person who can still work and still do things, but who suffers a stroke, or suffers from a disease, or is in an accident where their back breaks in 17 places and they're in chronic pain for months. And you have private health insurance, so private health insurance takes care of you until you hit your maximum. And then private health insurance says, we met your insurance policy. We paid $1 million, or we paid $2 million as part of our agreement with you, and now that we aren't going to pay anymore. And if you can say, I still need help, well, then you start pulling your own money out. I have to pay for my own way, I have to do co-pays here. And then you have a GoFundMe, and you start asking relatives for money. And you end up running out of money. So what do? Now your healthcare is free because you have no money anymore. So you've gone from being advantaged to disadvantaged for no other reason than you were sick. You know, you didn't ask for this. You didn't do anything in order to have the result of your sickness happen. And like this is absurd. Not only the cost, but the way that works. It's very trying. You know, hey, I have a bunch of money, but I got sick. And I have some money, but I don't have enough money. You know, I don't have $10 million to afford this fancy new cancer treatment. So what I'm going to do is sell all my stuff. I'm gonna give it all away. I'm gonna go on a cruise. I'm gonna have a wonderful, $400,000 month-long vacation. Then I go back, live with my kids in their garage, and start receiving my medical treatments. And this happens because of the system we have in the United States. People go bankrupt because of medical bills. And then now the government says we can help you. And that's, I can understand why that is so frustrating sometimes. The same issue can happen with, for example, I want to say disabled benefits, right? You're, I don't know, in a wheelchair and you receive disability benefits, or you have one arm because the other one got shot off in Iraq or something. So you receive disability benefits from the federal government, and that works until there's a point that you start working again as yourself and you make money, but you can't make too much money, because if you do, then hey, you have money coming in, we're going to cut off your disability benefits, but you don't have enough money coming in. So there are swaths of people in this country who have the opportunity to make more money but can't. You know, I have heard people say this at places I worked. You know, I can't work any overtime this week because if I do, I'll make too much money and I'll get kicked off this social service bit. You know, I'll get kicked off my government health care, or I'll get kicked out of my Section 8 housing and whatnot because I made too much money. But you didn't make quite enough money to move on. It's absurd. But this bit he says here, right? The utmost care has to be devoted to making it clear to the entire population. This simply has to be done because no alternative exists short of complete national collapse. So when I tax property, when I tax what you actually own, I'm saying that is needful for the maintenance of the nation. The nation exists in order to protect your property. And so if I'm taxing your property with the threat of taking it away if the tax isn't paid, that I'm saying that that tax is so important that the system itself would collapse. You would not. I have to take some of your property in order to protect your property entirely. You know, everything has a cost. Nothing is for free, and it turns out that this is literally needful for our activity, is the claim. This makes sense in a war. You know, when the nation is threatened by actual destruction, especially when you're, you know, a city-state like Rome and you don't have a huge buffer area to take hits on. But when it comes to less sudden events, when it comes to wars on poverty, when it comes to societal change, when it comes to wars on drugs, and I'm reminded of the last book, one of the other books I read, Capital in the 21st Century, where the author in that book recommended a tax on capital. He said something like if you have a total wealth of $10 million, a 2% tax, and so on. And the argument in that book for having this tax, which is a property tax, and therefore a very, very, very dangerous tax, is that if we do not tax total wealth like this, we don't tax capital, then capital will keep accumulating until we end up back in the era of robber barons, princes, and kings, where almost nobody owns anything. And we are a class of peasants, serfs, wage slaves, whatever you name it, with a very few rich, noble families, comparatively controlling everything. And so a tax on total wealth, a tax on capital, is a tax on property. It's saying you own this much stuff. You own this percentage of the nation. And owning that percentage of the nation is dangerous in itself. You may not be malicious in any way, but if you pass that wealth down to a child, a grandchild, a great-grandchild, you don't know what they are, and you're giving 1% of the entire wealth of the nation into the hands of a single person, and this is dangerous for our society. We live in a sort of society now in the United States where wealth is more evenly distributed than it was for 90% of human history. For 99% of human history, as far as we know, ran in something of a feudal system, ran with large numbers of subsistence farmers, ran with a few kings and princes, a few merchants here and there, but the vast majority of folk for the entirety of human history have basically lived on their farms. You I think would have had a more equitable share of wealth in the days of like hunter-gatherers, or in the days where like you live in villages in the Amazon. But going back to those days is not a life I particularly would want to live. And so we see this tax on property that is advocated for in the Capital in the 21st Century book. We have to ask, how dangerous is it really for there to be a extreme concentration of wealth at the upper end? And what is the level at which this wealth is dangerous? I think you could probably figure that out historically. You can say, when was the most equal time in American history where wealth was distributed equally? When at what point in American or European history or Chinese or Japanese history did the wealthy control the smallest amount of the total wealth? and then from there you can say that is either the goal or that is sustainable, or you can say, we want to get closer to that. You look at time periods like, okay, when the kings and princes ruled, when there were nobles, when the vast majority of people were serfs, what was the wealth concentration then? What was the median wage compared to the average wage? Median income versus compared to the average income, and how it was skewed and whatnot. Then you can say that is the bad point. And if we reach that point, then society will tend towards the same economic realities as we had then, which means the same political realities, which means some sort of feudalistic system where it's very hard to move between classes. So you want stuff like inflation, which is a tax on holding money. You want stuff like a tax on large accumulations of wealth. I argue for myself in my own head that you would not want to set it at an arbitrary number. It's a bad idea to say $10 million. That's a horrible idea, because you have inflation going up and down and so on. What you do is you set it as like a percentage of national wealth. If $1 billion, I don't know the exact numbers, but if $1 billion is 0.01% of national wealth, and then you can look at it and say, if you have 0.01% of national wealth, then we will tax you at 4% until your wealth falls below that level. And this is, in one sense, it appears putting a cap on wealth, but in another sense not, right? Because it says you can only be so rich in relation to the entirety of the nation. So if you want to be richer, if you want to have $1,000,001 and be taxed at 3%, then all you have to do is raise the economy of the entire country up to that level. What you use, GDP, GNP, total percentage of wealth, however you calculate it, wouldn't really matter. The point is that it doesn't put a cap on being rich. It puts a cap on how rich you can be in relation to the average person, in relation to the regular person in the country. And I think that's a much better way to go about it. It has the width of science to it. It has a pressure valve in it, for example. The danger, of course, is if the entire country grows poorer, then all of a sudden your $1 billion, you're like $900 million, instead of being taxed at 3%, is taxed at 4%, because the nation got poorer, so we're taxing you more because you are now a bigger percentage of the nation's wealth by default, because the total wealth has gone down. And that may be an issue worth discussing, but I think it's a good idea. Or at least an idea which has some cause and clear argument behind it. Because it does have that question we have to ask: complete national collapse. And with that in mind, Cicero's words in mind, we can ask, what property taxes do we pay today that are necessary in order to avoid complete societal collapse? Complete national collapse, complete economic or political collapse, complete educational collapse, for example. I know that our property taxes here, at least in California, are often used, or mostly used, to support the school system. And there are people who have the viewpoint, hey, I don't have kids, why am I paying for the school system? Hey, I came from a foreign country, I didn't go to the school, why am I paying for the school system? And in one case, if you went to school in like the 80s, well, somebody paid for your school system, so you're just paying that forward. So it doesn't matter if you have kids, you were a kid. And in the other case, you can ask, Well, yeah, you didn't benefit from it, but what sort of country do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a country where the education system falls apart? Do you want to live in a country where, you know, kids can't read? Do you want to live in a country where teachers teach to classrooms of 400 students on grass fields because there's no building for them to teach in? You know, do you want students that have never been able to afford a laptop? You know, never had a Chromebook that the school gave them so that they could play around with. These are questions to ask about any property tax. You know, how necessary is it? I think it is part of the issue. Because the other claim one can have is that property should never be taxed. You know, what I own outright. You know, if I own a house and I own land, I should never be taxed on that. If I own stock, I should never be taxed just because I own stock. I should never be taxed just because I own a car. If I use it, okay. If I sell it, okay. But just because it exists in my name, that seems horrible. And I understand if you are, I don't know, Bill Gates or something, and you go, hey, I worked for my billions. Why is it being taken away from me? I earned this, and so on. Or if you are someone who is rich and is passing that money down to your kid, you're going, hey, I worked hard for my money. I want to pass it down to my kid. You know, this is family wealth. This is how I keep my family safe. This is how I ensure that my family, you know, survives, by passing down my millions. You know, if you are the child who receives an inheritance, you say, this inheritance was given to me by my parents. You know, we worked like demons behind the plow for 7 generations. And then one person became a lawyer, and then one person became the mayor, and then the next person was able to be CEO of someplace, and then finally there's me, and I've inherited, you know, the house or 2 houses. And I think this is a very strong argument. This is a very good point to make. And any claim to take money from somebody because they own property, and because they receive property, even an inheritance tax, is inherently is dangerous by itself, and is offensive to the individual, offensive to the idea that I work hard for what I get. At the same time, it is foolish to think we can't pay taxes at all. It is foolish to think that all taxes are theft and that we never receive anything back for them. It is foolish to think that if one person happens to own, you know, 95% of the land in our country because they made smart real estate deals, and their ancestors did, and now they're passing on to their kid an ownership of 95% of the land in the nation, that, well, the kid earns that, and it's not a danger, it's not a problem, is also absurd. There must be limits to this, or else what's the point of doing anything? Right? What's the point of working hard if somebody already owns something? What's the point of trying to compete in a business if someone else has limitless resources to draw upon in order to drive you into the ground by lowering their prices? You want to sell, I don't know, you want to have a taco truck? Well, now if somebody owns, you know, 60% of the restaurants in the city, and they all decide to sell tacos for $1, and they can do that because they have the resources to accept the loss, then you, as a taco truck, are not going to exist for very long, because someone else has so much wealth you can't not compete with them. And you don't want that either. So where is the limit? This appears to be a more technical and scientific question, a more historical question to ask. What level of property of property concentration is dangerous? what level of wealth disparity is actually dangerous to the existence of our society. Because, as I mentioned before, you have to maintain this work. You have to maintain the system. You have to keep moving it, or else somebody else will move it for you. So the question is not how do we refuse to change the system? The question is, the system is the world is changing. The system we have is pushing changes in a certain way. How do we make sure that we manage to sail through the rapids? How do we make sure that we manage to push back against the effect of the system in order to right the course and solve the problems of today, not the problems of yesterday? It's the issue of like a war tax, right? If we're at war today, if we're at war this year, then a war tax makes sense. But if we were at war 10 years ago and we won the war and the war tax is still ongoing because we might end up in a war again someday, then you are playing with fire at that point. And this all arrives from, the claim by Cicero. If any government should find itself under the necessity of levying a tax on property, the utmost care has to be devoted to making it clear to the entire population that this simply has to be done because no alternative exists short of complete national collapse. Yeah, okay, so later, the author says, throughout history, whenever a tax develops that is productive of revenue but oppressive to the taxpayers, like the income tax, the tax will continue. The financial needs of the state override most constitutional, moral, and cultural ideals. And yeah, that definitely happens. We have a tax on something. We take a bunch of money, and then we spend that money, and then the government spends that money, as we, the government, spends that money. Then you have bureaucratic issues pop up again. Hey, if we don't spend that money, we won't get that money next year. If we have money, then we can always think of something else to do with it. We can always spend that money on some new idea. We can always spend that money trying something. We can always spend that money on research, or on buying more guns and tanks, or on buying a new office. And this creates a non-virtuous cycle where the government takes more and more and more money for its own purposes, eventually hurting the economy of the state so much that it takes less money. And then what does the government do when it takes in less money than it expected? Or what does the government do when it takes in more money than it needs? You have to have a mechanism for either slowing spending or a mechanism for returning extra funds to the economy, to the people. You remand taxes, for example. If you collected too much in taxes, instead of always spending more and more and more and just pushing the bureaucratic dung ball along like a dung beetle, growing bigger and bigger and bigger until it's the size of a soccer ball, and the whole thing collapses under its own weight. So what he's beginning to point out here is that the people of a nation should keep a very close eye on their government's spending and taxing habits. And he's focusing now here on the taxing habits. But spending is as important, I would say. If you don't know what the government is spending money on, if you don't know if it's a good idea to spend that money, if you don't If you know the government has a tax, but you don't know what that tax is being spent on, then you don't understand the tax. If the government is taking money from you and says, this is needful, this is needful, this is needful, of course the government is going to say that. Any organization is going to say, this is needful, this is needful, this is needful. You know, your local workplace, if it could get you, if the store you work at or the company you work at could get you to work overtime without pay, they do that. Of course they would. Why wouldn't they get more out of you, and then they can use your unpaid labor for something? Or if they get you to agree that we're not going to pay you overtime for when you do overtime, well, then that's also a benefit for them. And they're going to try and the company will push you and push you and push you and push you to work harder and harder and harder for them. In the same way that the government will have a tendency to push you to work harder and harder and harder for them if there is a tax being taken in. So keep a close eye on these. Try to understand what's going on. And what this also says to me is that government obfuscation of taxing or spending patterns is an extremely bad sign. If the government is either not willing to tell you what it spent money on or not willing to tell you how much money it took, and that ever happens, that should be alarm bells ringing like a comet across the sky. Because if the government as a public entity, as a group that represents the people of the nation, that makes laws and is elected by you, or at least is allowed to exist because of the will of the people, the mandate of heaven and so on, then that means the government is doing something they don't think you will like, or they don't think you agree with, or they don't think you will understand. And I would say, secrecy begets secrecy begets secrecy until the government is a black box where money goes in, money comes out, and you don't understand what's going on or what's happening. And within that black box is the opportunity for fraud and waste and abuse. It is the opportunity for corruption and so on. This doesn't mean that the government as a black box will do this for certain, but it does mean that it will do that for certain eventually, because it can. The same is true for almost any organization, right? A workplace that is a privately owned workplace that does not produce much economic data for public consumption, doesn't like to tell people how much they made or where they made their money from, is owned by a very, very small core group of investors. So it's hard to get access to their financial documents, who submits the very minimum amount of information required to the FCC or whatnot. FTC, Federal Commerce Commission, Federal Trade Commission, the government, or people can read it openly. Then eventually that organization will do something bad with the money. Maybe not necessarily now, maybe not with the founder, maybe not founders' kids, maybe not with the current group of investors, but eventually power corrupts somewhere down the line. And this is, one of the reasons why kings and princes are bad, because you may very well get a good dictator in there. You very, very well may get a good king in there. But the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one, somewhere down the line, you're going to end up with a bad dictator or a bad king. You're going to end up with a bad company CEO. You're going to end up with a bad group of investors eventually, if your organization survives for long enough. And the only way to combat that, I would say, is with openness and change. Right? You have the company be open so that people can investigate what it's doing. You have the company be clear in its intentions and its actions. There may be information the company wants to hide because their competitors could benefit economically from that. But there has to be a limit to that, right? It's like the government. The government has an interest in keeping certain information secret. Black ops events, the location of certain military bases. Exactly how much we spent on nuclear bombs, or exactly how many nuclear missiles we have. Or maybe we are building another warship. Maybe we aren't. Maybe we are training people somewhere, maybe we aren't. Maybe we have a cybersecurity division, maybe we don't. There's strategic ambiguities there. But when it comes to taxes, when it comes to the money going in and out, when it comes to the bare finances, I think that we should argue for an openness that is at a high level. And this isn't simply because I want to know what's going on. This isn't simply because I don't trust the organization or the government or whatnot. It's because secrecy begets secrecy. Power ends up corrupting. And eventually, just because systems change over time and new people come into power, if the system isn't open, then the system will change. And the system will change in such a way that we don't know what it's changing. And eventually you have a company that does something like, was it Teflon? I think. The company may put Teflon on frying pans and they knew it was poisoning people. But they stayed quiet because it would hurt their bottom line. And then it came out later. Because it's secrecy. It's going to hurt us if we tell people about this. Well, exactly. And it's going to hurt you because it hurt a whole bunch of other people. The same happens with the, Monsanto, I know, is involved in things like this. And another one is the company that did the opioid crisis. For example, you can ask, companies that are heavily involved in the oil business or the cigarette business. Did they do their own studies about how the harm they cause? Was there some shady business going on with cross-border trade around oil? Are there agreements that companies have with certain governments which are the remnants of colonialism, for example, or which are due to bribes, or which are due to a personal relationship between the members of two owners of two different companies? And what happens when the next person takes over? I think this happened with the company that makes sriracha. Like, they got all the peppers for their sriracha sauce from one supplier through a handshake agreement, and then eventually this fell apart because I think that the supplier's son took over and changed his mind, went in a different agreement. I'm not entirely sure about the extent of those allegations or activities. It's just something I saw on Twitter. It's non-verifiable for me without looking into it, right? I have to read and study the sources and see how certain they are and whatnot. And when we go to the government, we can ask the same thing. There have been studies on the black population of the United States, which were reprehensible. For example, you have massive waste that has happened in government contracts. You have government contracts which are handed out on a very corrupt looking basis. And how do we even know that it happened unless the information was public, unless we could look at it? And so part of the problem, I think, of talking about organizations in this way is it sounds that when I say you need to be more open, you need to be more honest, you need to reveal more of your financials, you need to be willing to admit your mistakes, that I am accusing the people currently in charge of the companies of being bad people or of doing bad things. But that's not precisely what I'm doing. I'm saying that even if you are in charge and you're a good person and you're doing good things and you're just keeping your company rolling along without corruption or stealing from people or taking advantage of something or making short-term decisions that have terrible bad long-term effects, I'm saying that eventually someone will, at your company, at your state, at your organization, someone will eventually, the next person after you, or the next person, or the next person, or the next person. There's a reason very few companies survive for hundreds of years, and it is not because the companies themselves are problematic, because companies can change, because they are just an organization of ownership, an organization of money. So you can shift where you invest and so on. So companies make mistakes, but sometimes these mistakes are unforced. Sometimes these mistakes are due to somebody taking advantage of something, when they shouldn't. And why shouldn't they? Because it is injurious to the organization which they represent and are not trusted by and are given control of. Again, it's an interesting bit, because anytime you criticize an organization, anytime you criticize a person who, because organizations are made up of individual people, they may take that as an insult, take it as a judgment upon them, but it's not a judgment upon them in many cases. It is just a judgment upon the course of human history, the course of human nature, the course of organizational change. Change is to a great extent random and goes up and down and up and down. You cannot determine exactly what's going to happen. You can't determine that a mistake won't be made at some point, and a mistake will be made at some point, and that may not have a positive effect, because the opposite can happen too, right? You can stumble upon a drug you didn't even know you had access. You can stumble upon. We were involved in this economic opportunity at the right time. Just accidentally. As we were having our company was starting up, just beginning, I happened to run across the CEO of so and so, and he liked my idea, and we all of a sudden we started working with company JYK or whatnot, and that's how we got started. Accidents happen, good and bad, and how do you prepare for the bad? You have rules and laws, and you have openness so that these rules and laws can be checked for their effectiveness. And you have openness and clarity to the outside of the organization, because an organization can be captured, but it is more difficult for the entire population to be captured. It's the same idea that American democracy has, right? If you make the democracy big enough, then there are so many competing views that it is hard for one to take it over completely. So how do you open up? How do you increase the democratic level of your organization, the democratic safety valve? The number of eyes about whether your government is working. You allow more and more eyes to look upon it. You protect yourself by opening yourself, and even though this information you give out makes you vulnerable, makes you criticizable, it comes with it benefits as well, is what I would argue theoretically happens. Yeah. Okay, he says here, taxpayer contentment was unquestionably more important than revenue collection, unlike modern practice. And taxpayer contentment is very important in the days of ye old empire or ye old colonial system, or ye old, city state who collects rent, because if you have to raise soldiers to go burn down, the city of Jerusalem in order to get your taxes back, and you have to do that every 10 years because the taxpayers are very uncontent, then you end up destroying your tax base. You end up spending so much money trying to get money in that you lose money, even though you're raising taxes higher and higher and higher and higher. So taxpayer contentment is important as well, especially if you're the government. If the people are happy to pay taxes, people say, my taxes are going to a good cause, my taxes are being used efficiently, I understand how my taxes are used, there is someone I can ask about this, there is someone willing to tell me, there is information being passed along, I am receiving accolades and benefits because of my tax. I have a sticker I can put on my car saying, I paid taxes. And if I show up with this sticker to the police station, they'll give me a lollipop. Who knows? There is a letter is sent to every taxpayer in the entire nation saying, here's a link to a website. And on this website, you can see what your taxes went to. Or you can see your name being read by a employee of the state on a live stream that runs 24/7. Well, they would say, so-and-so paid his taxes and they did this and this and this, or so-and-so paid his taxes and it was paid this amount of taxes, for example. The amount, I understand that may be a bit more iffy because then you're telling other people how much you owe, so maybe that's a bad idea. And then on the other hand, okay, but what the opposite problem of that, which would arise, right, is, hey, what if your name is not up there? What if you didn't pay any taxes? Right? What if the government or the IRS comes up with the bright idea of giving a name, of spelling out the names of those who they have convicted for tax evasion, or those who they are investigating for tax evasion, or those whose tax payments are suspect in some way, right? What if now you have a political party standing up and saying, so our taxes that we paid were used for this nefarious activity, and we don't agree with that, and every person who paid this tax is liable. So perhaps you could do something like, I know when I file my taxes, there is at the end a series of options. It's like, do you want to give $25 to this cause or that cause, or so on, like the presidential election committee, or food, or to help maintain national parks and whatnot. So perhaps it could be those people who click one of those buttons at the end of when you submit your taxes, and who donate essentially taxes to the government, donate a charity that they aren't called upon to do, receive some accolade. And their name is mentioned, their name is printed somewhere, the name is, chiseled on a stone monument. Their name is put into a lottery, and a naval ship will be named after them. Instead of a president, this is the naval ship John Smith. John Smith paid his taxes in 1997. He was a good citizen. This is the building, and Angelina Taylor. That is the name of this building. And so on, right? There are options here for making people content to pay their taxes. And then what he's trying to point out here is what happens if people are not content to pay their taxes, right? If people stand here, tax is theft. I don't know what my taxes are being used for. You know, I worked hard and the government is just taking 25% of everything I made. And I save my money. I don't need Social Security. You know, I have health insurance. I don't need Medicare. Blah. And the government says, or the people who vote for these activities, vote for these taxes, say, yes, you do. We demand that you do. You know, and everyone's worried about the free rider problem and whatnot, right? Then all of a sudden, you start running into trouble. People start campaigning on lowering taxes. And that may be a good thing, but it is very different, I would say, to campaign on lowering taxes versus to campaign on lowering spending. Yes, yeah. I think that one could campaign in today's America on lowering spending without campaigning on lowering taxes. Because if you campaign on lowering taxes, then you are working with the discontentment in the country around paying taxes. But if you are not equally committed or more committed to lowering payments, then all you're doing is attacking the system that puts you in power. You know, you're attacking the electoral system that gives you the right to make decisions for the people. And at least in America, the largest expenses are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense. So one way to attack revenue is to attack, you know, like the IRS, the Forestry Service, the firefighters, and whatnot. But these are very small fish. So I do wonder what is the opportunity in campaigning on modifying Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid, on raising taxes or lowering spending or doing something, because that would have the largest effect by dint of those projects being the largest spending projects. Everything else is small potatoes. Or at least that's one of the complaints I tend to hear about. You know, we're closing on this and this and this, and then we're not touching, you know, the 99% of our actual costs for government. So it sounds like, you know, the Presidential Efficiency Organization, whatever, saved $500 million, and you look at like that $500 million is the cost of, you know, a few F-35s. You know, that $500 million is the cost of running Medicare for 23 hours or something. But you have then vested interests, very, very large vested interests, very complex systems like Medicare and Medicaid. So it's easier to attack smaller groups and smaller organizations. And this goes back to that speech from a few days ago, right? If it is easier to attack these smaller groups and do that, then you are taking the easy path, and that's probably not what you want to do. This is probably going to end up causing problems in the future. Like you know, today the United States takes the easy path of cutting taxes and raising spending the entire time, and we're funding this by debt. And all that means is we get to ignore our problems and pass them on to the next generation, which is me. So, you know, you understand why the millennials are righteously pissed sometimes. Okay, let's going. Oh, he talks about the Romans here. And he begins to talk about civil liberties. He says, in time, the reader will discover that civil liberties are adjusted to a tax system. The tax system is not adjusted to civil liberties, which means that the author is very critical of the income tax, because he says in order to tax income, you must know a person's income, right? You must know a lot of information about people. In order to stop tax avoidance or stop smuggling, you now must inspect all shipments in and out. You must know what is happening in order to tax it. So instead of a nation saying, we will allow instead of a government saying, we will allow ourselves to collect this amount of information about people, and then we will tax based on that information that we collect. But we will not collect more than this amount, and our taxes are based on the information we can receive, right? If the government doesn't know how much a person has in their bank account, because the bank is private and the government doesn't ask these questions, if the government does not investigate the wealth of its citizens, if the government does not investigate, what you have shipped in from overseas or what you ship out, then the government cannot tax you based on how much money you have in a bank. If the government doesn't know how much you're being paid in a job, then the government can't tax your income. But if the government wants to tax your income, then all of a sudden it has to know about your income. So as you raise taxes, you tend to learn more about your people. And this is, in the American view, a very disliked idea. Like, why does the government have to know this about me? Why does the government have to know this about me? Why does the government have to know my gender? What does that have to do with anything? Why does the government have to know my race? What does that have to do with anything? Why does the government have to know how much I made last year? What does that have to do with anything? Well, in many cases, it has to do with taxes, or it has to do with a program that the taxes are being spent on, right? Well, we want to know about your race because we want to know about diversity, and because that affects something we are trying to do or change. We want to know how much income you made because we want to know about your taxes. We want to know what you imported because we want to tax it, and so on. Or we want to know what you imported because we want to make sure you are not importing explosives or poison or anything dangerous. And so we need to know what you're importing. In order to know what you're importing, we need to spend money, and we already know what you're importing, so may as well tax what you're importing. You have these roll-on effects. But it all comes down to information. How much information do I have about you? And if I have that information, then I can tax you. Right? In ancient times, during the Egyptian days, he mentions, no farmer knew in advance what the amount of tax would be. Why? Because the lecturers or the tax assessors come down from the city or come down from the palace and look and say, okay, you're going to pay us this much, right? These are the charges. And in good tax systems, you have to be like, you're going to pay us 10%. 10% of whatever you made, that's what we're getting. But that's very something that the government does not like. It's like we think we're going to get this much wheat from the farmers this year. But you go down to the farmers and it turns out it was a bad year. So you get 50% of the wheat for your wheat tax, because that's how taxes were raised in the old days before money was a thing. You took the corn, the wheat, the potatoes, something they grew as a tax. And so in old days in Japan, the nobles were paid their taxes in bundles of rice, bags of rice, barrels of rice, and these sorts of things. And that was the funds and money they had before money was invented and used. And if you're a poor peasant, especially in the ancient days, you did not have money. But money is invented, and that allows for a market system, which allows for more efficient movement and economic growth. So that turned out to be good in the long term, mostly. Right. But so what is the government want to do? The government, as an organization that spends, wants to have a steady income, like anybody. Wants to know exactly how much it's going to get. So you start going down to the farmers and you say, I have the tax records for the last 15 years about how much you produced every year. And you produce this average amount of wheat every year. So we're going to take 10% of that average amount, and that's what we're going to tax you every year. So then if you have a bad year, hey, we get the same amount. If you have a good year, hey, we get the same amount and you have some extra. If it's a bad year, we get the same amount and you end up starving. But the government likes this because it knows exactly how much it's going to get. And when you average it out across the nation, it works mostly fine. If there is a nationwide drought, then hey, you give some of that money back. But if it's a local drought, or if one farmer is affected because his field's burned in an accidental fire, well, the government doesn't really care about that. That's just the variance in the lives of the citizens. So one of the major issues that people can have, I think, is you go in to a CPA or H&R Block or a tax preparation place, and you give them the information, they fill out the forms, and they say, you owe this much in tax. And it's a surprise. And it's, oh my gosh. Or, oh, hooray. Oh, I owe less tax than I thought. Oh, I owe more tax than I thought, right? And when taxes are a surprise, they are not taken happily. You're not sitting there going, oh, wonderful. I wonder how much my taxes are going to be. I hope it's good this year. No, you're sitting there going, oh, God, okay, I hope my taxes aren't too much this year. And I have enough cash on hand to pay it. And this is a cost because you have to keep cash on hand to pay your taxes. And that cash could have been invested on something and used in some way. Instead, it's just sitting around as a insurance in case your taxes are too high or too low. And there are people who have that ability to deal with these taxes. There are people who make so little money that they get money back in their taxes every year, for example. But it is still a horrid surprise. Like, can you imagine sitting there in the middle of the year going, okay, so I'm getting money back in my taxes. I usually get like $2,000 back in my taxes. I hope that's what I get this year. Because I need that $2,000 for something or other. But then it turns out that you get $1,400 back because of a change of a law you didn't even know about. This is something that happens with companies where the end of the year bonus is most of what you expect to get, or the end of quarter bonus. And then it turns out, hey, the company had a bad year, bonuses are less than we thought. Or it turns out that you didn't reach your quota, so we're not giving you your bonus. And that bonus is like 60% of your actual income, of your expected income, then it's a horrible surprise. And you don't like that. So a bonus system is nice as long as you have enough to live on, as long as you live in such a way that you don't rely on the bonus. If you live in such a way that you do rely on the bonus, or if you live in such a way that you are on that edge, right, where taxing as being a surprise can be a very, very horrid surprise, where now you don't have the money to pay it, or you have to sell something dear in order to pay it. Or you don't have enough, or you don't quite have enough money to pay both your taxes and your rent. And this doesn't happen to a lot of people, but it does happen to somebody, because there's always that gray zone there. And this ends up happening. And that happens to people, and you're worried about it. And who knows? Are my taxes higher than I thought, lower than I thought? I don't know. So whenever taxes are a surprise, this is bad. You should know how much you're paying taxes. So, like, payroll taxes are good because you get a check and so much is taken out of your taxes, but after a few pay periods, it's the same amount getting taken out of your taxes. And you grow to become accustomed to this. And if you work less hours or you work more hours, the variance of tax money taken out is not too high. So if you have like progressive taxes, you want to have a very graduated growth in these taxes. You don't charge 10% taxes on wages 1 year because you made this amount, and then next year you went up the level and we charge you 20% of those taxes. No, we charge you 10%, we charge you 10.5%, we charge you 11, 11.5, 12%, 12.5. As you go up, you want a very gentle curve on any changes in tax level. Okay. And then people often get around their tax payments being up or down, being questionable, being unknown, by having a tax withholding. You say, well, I'm going to withhold this much tax and that will probably cover it. And most of the times it does, but sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes it's less. And you're like, oh gosh, I held back. I mean, imagine you're a big enough company. I held back $15 million for tax payments, and it turns out I only needed to pay $12 million in taxes. That's $3 million I could have used to grow the business and could have helped. If you're an individual and with your own business, hey, I held back $30,000 to pay the business taxes this year, and I ended up paying less taxes, or I ended up paying more. I ended up owing more taxes, and now I got to spend extra money. Right? When you don't know how much your taxes are going to be, this is a very bad, very precarious situation to be in. It makes people not like taxes. So if you're going to make a tax, have it be a stable one. So he's going to argue in this book for a percentage tax, that you take a certain percentage of income or wealth or wages or whatever the case may, or business earnings, whatever the case may be, production. You take a certain percentage of the reduction instead of a flat amount. And again, this is, I think, a wiser idea for taxes. But you can understand why the government wouldn't like this. Because the government's like, hey, we get 10% of what people of what you made in income. We get 10% of what you made in income. And the government on the other side of that going, okay, we don't know. I don't know if this guy made a ton of money this year or made no money. Like the government's sitting there going, maybe we did really good in the economy this year, and we'll have a bunch of tax money. Maybe the economy was really bad, and we're going to have low tax money. So that, I think, is a good point to make. That it means the government is on the variance instead of the individual being on the variance, which means that the individual is happier about taxes because they already know, hey, I'm going to 11.5% of my income is being spent on taxes. So I know exactly how much I have to withhold every pay period, every quarter, because it's 11.5% of what I have. And okay, so this is, to an extent, I'm pretty sure the way it works, because I have heard stories of like California one year had more, it took in more money for its tax than it expected, and then it had to send checks to a bunch of its citizens in order to refund the tax. I mean, because it expected more. So the government doesn't always know exactly how much it's getting. And this should inspire the government to be more careful with its spending because it doesn't know exactly how much it's going to get. Unfortunately, this does not happen, which I think is interesting because I know that California has done this, that they have a budget and then the state collects less in taxes than it thought it would, has less income than it thought it would, and the budget has to be suddenly and very quickly revised. Certain programs get cut. And the smart version of this is you have some sort of slush fund, a rainy day fund that you keep topped up, and when you collect less taxes and you use money from the rainy day fund to make up the difference in revenue. When you have more taxes, then you push that extra into the rainy day fund, and you have this rainy day fund sitting there just sort of outside as a buffer for variance in income. And we do have that in California to an extent that I know. We have emergency funds that we draw on sometimes, and then we must conversely top them up in other times. So one thing I feel like I'm thinking about as I go through this book is I'm remembering my own ideas and stories I've heard about tax and budget events in my state, right? And I'm going, okay, based on something this guy says that is generally true or generally the case about taxes, good and bad taxes. And I can say, okay, so we do that in a certain way, but I don't know to what extent, right? I'm not a tax lawyer. I haven't studied how California runs its taxes. I haven't studied how much variance you allow for, because that's also important. How much variance do you expect? If your variance is 50%, that's going to be very dangerous. You're going to need a very large slush fund to cover that. So it's a matter of managing risk at that point, which becomes a technical question and a historical question. And then his information from before, his idea from before that the government will need to or seek to acquire information in order to collect this tax becomes also true, because the government seeks to acquire information not just to collect the tax, but so that the government can estimate how much tax it will collect. Because you don't want to run a government on a day-to-day tax collection issue. You want to run it on, well, we have a plan for 6 years out, to build these to build these roads or these bridges. We have contracts that last for 15 years. Who's gonna run the electrical power system in this city, sort of thing. Every 5 years we renegotiate the garbage collection agreement, and of course the how often you collect taxes raises the organizational cost for that activity. If I collect taxes every day, right, then I have to then that means that money is moved around, and there's a lot of counting all the time. If I collect taxes every 3 months, then we only have to do this counting activity every 3 months. I took a class in accounting once, and the teacher was telling me that when she worked as an accountant, it was essentially, the 2 weeks out of a month, she'd work like mad, overtime in the office, crazy hours. And the other 2 weeks, nothing. She had nothing to do because she had completed she had input all the information. And presumably, this is a more efficient method. This is, again, something that you would have to study. Like, is collecting a tax... Obviously, if you collect the tax daily, you deal with a lot of variance. And depending on the system, you may end up spending a lot of time and effort doing this. Right? Like, say you collect taxes every 3 months, but you have one tax collector. Well, then every day you send the tax collector out to a different farmer, and you stagger it so that every farmer in 3 months pays taxes, but pays them at different times. So instead of the government every 3 months receiving a whole bunch of taxes, they receive a different amount of money from each farmer every day. And if you make this large enough, then you end up handling the variance. But this requires a lot of information. It requires employing a person every day. And if it is more efficient to, in fact, have one tax collector that can visit 15 farms in one day, then you just have the tax collector visit 15 farms on day one, 15 farms on day two, and you've done all 30 farms. Instead of employing the tax collector, for 30 days out of the year, you employ him 2 days out of the year because he can efficiently collect the taxes. So there may be benefits in that case from collecting taxes, at the end of a month, and instead of daily. And of course, there's also year-wide variance, right? People are going to take a lot more money in or businesses are going to take a lot more money in during certain times of the year. If you're a florist, for example, Easter is probably a big day, and Valentine's Day is huge. If you are a retailer, then Black Friday and Christmas is a very big day. If you sell swimsuits, then summer is when you make your money, and you don't do anything during winter. These become technical questions. I think you could do studies in these, and there's probably people who do study this and know a whole lot more about me, like why we have a tax system and why it's in place and why is this way. And I hope at least that information is open, that we know why the system is done, and that information being open, we can fix our tax collection system when there is an issue. So it says the tax system is not adjusted to civil liberties. We can also look at this in a different way, that civil liberties are protected because information about our liberties is open. So perhaps we can make the argument that the tax system is protected by information about the tax system being available to taxpayers. And instead of hiding how your tax system is run or why certain tax decisions are made, you stand up and you make the argument for having made the right decision. This is the stance of the IRS on this issue, and this is why. As opposed to the rule being buried in some guideline somewhere, and you have to be a tax professional in order to understand what the guideline is, and you have to be a tax historian and a political historian just to understand why the tax is being applied in this certain way. So perhaps open taxes also argue for simpler taxes. That is a question. Or a higher level of education for the populace. Right? That's an interesting question in itself. What level of education do you want your populace to have? Because if you have a bunch of dumb, ill-educated, illiterate folk, then this means it's very easy to tell them what to do. It's very easy to say, I am the supreme leader. Look at my powers. Look at all the things I can build. I look at all the information I control. You can't talk to people outside the country. You can't read the histories because you can't read at all. So I'm going to tell you the histories, and so on. So a ill-educated populace is easier to control. But on the other hand, an ill-educated populace can also be riled up. If you get one demagogue who says, actually, all your problems are the supreme leaders, and then you end up with riots, and the demagogue leads the people against you, and you're torn down. And you may well be a good supreme leader, right? You may well be right, or feel you're right at least, and yet one person speaking to an angry mob can tear down the gates of your castle and take it over. And then the person who tends to lead angry mobs to the gates of the Lord's castle and tear it down are not necessarily the people you want running the entire system in peacetime. And so there are instances where an ill-educated populace is harder to control, or perhaps an ill-educated populace is easier to control, but harder to ascertain whether your control is valid or not. Because a well-educated populace, literate populace, also produces many writings, also produces much information. So you can go online and do research about how your citizens feel regarding your government and you. You can have polls, for example. You don't have to always go looking for information. People, with a well-educated, literate, politically active populace, they will tell you what they think of how you are doing. And so discontent should be easier to spot. As well, you have many more people working towards fixing problems. And the downside of that, from the point of view of a leader, is you have to be able to defend your decisions. Right? You have to at least, you can't simply go up and say, well, I like this idea and I'm a genius. I like this idea and I'm the best thing ever created. I like this idea and obviously God put me in charge, so you do what I say. No, you have to actually be able to tell people, I like this idea and this is why. I like this idea because it has this effects. I like this idea because I'm basing it on this information. I like this idea because it upholds this ideal, for example. Okay, so then he talks here about Rome again. Okay, and he mentions here first that the taxes of the Senate, the estates of the senators were tax immune. So if you lived in Rome and you were a farmer, you were a tradesman, or you were a soldier, then you paid taxes. But if you were a senator, you did not pay taxes. So eventually what happens, he argues, is that you're a peasant and you have a farm and you pay taxes to the government. Government takes your stuff. You end up poor. And eventually, because you're poor, you run into economic trouble. And just over the hill is a senator, rich senator, politically connected, owns a lot of land, who says to you, the poor peasant, come work for me. Come farm my land, and I will take less from you than the government does. The government taxes you at 20%. Come work on my land, I will tax you at 10%. So the peasant moves from his own freeholding farm to working for the rich senator, who doesn't pay taxes and therefore can charge rent less than the tax. So it makes economic sense for the peasant to move and start working for him. But by doing this, the peasant gives up the ownership of his farm. Or the governor or the senator says, I will buy your farm from you and then charge you, 5% rent. And the peasant is thinking, hey, I already pay 20% tax to the government, which is a 20% rent for daring to grow food on my land. I may as well work for the senator who's going to charge me 5%. You repeat that ad nauseum a few thousand times, and all of a sudden you end up with rich landowners who do not pay tax, owning a whole bunch of land, with people who have to work for them. Because now there are no more free farms. All the free farms are bought up by some rich senator. Meanwhile, the central government of Rome, where it used to have a large number of freeholder farmers it collected taxes from, now has a bunch of senators who are 10 times richer than they were before, but who pay no tax. And tax proceeds for the government go down and down and down. So what is the answer? What do? Obviously, obviously you tax the senators. You say there has been a transfer of ownership, transfer of wealth, so now the senators no longer enjoy tax immunity. Now the senators have to pay tax. But you have a problem. The senators are senators. The senators are in charge of the political system. In order to change the political system, to put taxes on the senators, you have to convince the senators to tax themselves. Which means you have to convince the senators that if they do not pay tax, the system will collapse. And Rome will be no more. And if the senators see this, if the rich nobles see this, then well and good. They will pay the tax. If the rich nobles do not see this, if the rich nobles start having discontent, hey, I now as a noble pay taxes to Rome of 20%. And so I have to charge the peasants who work under me 25%. Because I need 20% of their production for Rome and 5% of their production just so I can maintain my lifestyle. So I know when you and your ancestors came here, I know when you and your father came here, I promised a 5% tax. Well, now I have to charge you a 25% tax. Because I agreed to be taxed for Rome because if taxes are not paid, Rome does not have a strong military, Rome falls apart. And these senators have discontent, rising discontent. The peasants think, why am I working here? You have competition now between the senators, between the nobles. Hey, I'll charge you a 21% tax. I'll charge you a 22% tax. That guy is charging you a 27% tax. And people start leaving your lands. Well, I don't want people to leave my land. That harms my economic interests. I better take charge of them. And now you have a collapse of the central government. You have land-holding feudal nobles controlling a bunch of peasants, who and the nobles then have to find a reason to remain in charge. You know, I protect you. I have noble blood. Whatever the case may be. And because of too high a tax, because of particularly a social class which does not pay taxes, or a social class which pays very low taxes, you shift to a feudal system by pure economic pressure. This happens to Rome. Like this is literally what happens to Rome over the course of a few centuries. Is what he is arguing here. And so he says, the bondage of farmers was finally, because remember, now the freeholding farmers, now peasants. The bondage of farmers was finally extended to workers and artisans. The cobbler and all his descendants were to make shoes forever. His sons were to marry cobblers' daughters. The final product was the complete enslavement of Rome's economic classes. They became castes to make this tax system work. The emperors of the 4th century, and above all Diocletian, grew up in the atmosphere of violence and compulsion. They took their duties seriously, and they were animated by the sincerest love of their country. Their aim was to save the Roman Empire, and they achieved it. They never asked whether it was worthwhile to save the Roman Empire in order to make a vast prison for scores of millions of men. So today, you have an issue. In America of today, essentially, if a company pays less tax than an individual does working for himself, if a large company can pay less tax than a small single owner corner shop person or spouse group paying their taxes, then eventually or an individual working for themselves, then eventually what will happen is those little corner shops will go out of business. And their sons and daughters will end up working for the companies. And you have a repeat of the feudal system, except now it is a wage slave system. You have massive numbers of people in the country who are essentially slaves to a company. Because if they try to leave and start their own business and not work for a wage for a company, then they pay higher taxes than that company. So the company can always compete with them on a advantageous level. The same happens with any economic system where you have a class that pays a lower tax. Is what I'm seeing here when he's talk about the fall of Rome, right? If multi-billionaires pay a low tax compared to the middle class, then the middle class eventually disappears and turns into a group of people working for the multi-billionaires. This is pure economics. And this is exactly what happened to the Roman Empire. It is, I believe, is what I understand of him talking about here. Because the other thing that can happen, of course, is, hey, the rich pay low taxes, and I'm poor. Well, if I want to compete with the rich, I need to pay lower taxes. But if I report my income to the government, I pay higher taxes. So what I do is I do not report my income to the government. And therefore I pay lower taxes. And you're poor, but or you have your own business. What do? You go to the government and you say, I made no money last year. Or you go to the government and you say, I made just enough to survive last year. Meanwhile, in your back room, you have some gold coins. Meanwhile, you're paying people under the table. And meanwhile, you're taking in monies in cash. Meanwhile, you're importing things nefariously. Meanwhile, you're buying smuggled goods because they're cheaper because the government doesn't tax them. And so what happens, he says, again, he claims this is exactly what happened to the Roman Empire. That you have tax avoidance among the rich. The rich pay less taxes because they've passed laws so that they pay less taxes. That is, they legally pay less tax than another group. Okay? And then you have the most productive members of society, the entrepreneurs, the ones creating their own businesses, the ones who work hard and try to make it and try to improve their lives and grow. You have the ones who start new businesses and who improve technologies and who challenge existing systems. Have one of two options available to them. Either they can pay taxes legally and end up serfs and peasants because they can't compete. Or they practice tax avoidance. What does he call it? Tax evasion. They practice tax evasion. And the government doesn't collect that tax. So what is the only, if you're poor, what is the only way to compete with the rich on an economic level? If the rich pay a lower level of taxes, a lower percentage of their monies and their income in taxes than you, then you have to act illegally. So if you have a tax system, again, I think I mentioned this in the beginning, or at the end of last time, there's an argument to be had for a tax system which is equal across all social levels. 10% of income from everybody, no matter how rich or how poor. And then you exclude the very poorest because you can't squeeze money out of the stone, and you're losing more money trying to get that money from the stone because they're dirt poor and they have no money. Okay? But you have this flat tax. That makes that there's an argument for that. There is also an argument for a progressive tax, where the rich pay more. But for a regressive tax where the poor pay more and the rich pay less, this has a tendency to then concentrate wealth at the upper end, at the high level. And this is an issue we have in America today that I hear about quite often, right? That some rich person or some rich group or some rich company pays effectively pays a lesser amount of tax. And there are reasons for this, right? There may be very good reasons for not having taxes be applied in some way, or for allowing people to report certain information which reduces their taxes. Hey, I took a loss this year, or I donated to charity, or I invested in the company, or it's capital gains, but that's theoretical. I haven't actually sold anything yet, so I didn't gain any money. Right? There are arguments for this. And each of those individual actions, but these individual tax breaks stack on to each other. And eventually you have this result where the ultra rich or the ultra wealthy or the ultra big companies, through taking advantage of enough types of tax avoidance opportunities, enough types of lowering their taxes, pay an effectively lower level of tax than those groups who cannot take advantage of all these tax breaks. Which means that the middle class and the poor class get squeezed economically because of government activity. So you end up eventually with a very large class of very poor people who are either peasants or wage slaves or renters of one sort or another, and a very small class of owners and rich. And this is I would argue, an unstable socio-political status to have, because either you have a well-educated, literate populace who talks to each other and figures this out, so you have large numbers of poor people who are very discontented with the system, or you have large numbers of ignorant, illiterate, super religious Russian serfs, for example, who become very easily riled up because they are discontent and shown their discontent. Then the entire system eventually falls. And you have peasant rebellions, you have slave rebellions, you have mass demonstrations on the streets, you have strikes of entire nationwide groups of people. If all the air traffic controllers go on strike, for example, because they're discontented, that only happens if they're educated and talk to each other a lot. Okay, so how do you stop that? Well, you make sure that the air traffic controllers aren't educated and don't talk to each other a lot. Well, that leads to a lot of crashed airplanes, and all of a sudden you have a different problem, right? So like how do you manage this system? If you have a small number of rich owners and a large number of poor people, I think you Either you have enough wealth in the system that the poor folk still have a good quality of life, or you have to redistribute the wealth in the system to a more equalized level. And this means, in practice, progressive taxes. It is how I interpret his information about the fall of Rome, according to its tax information. And this is interesting here because the bit he talks about here is something which seems very clear in a way. Okay, the immediate cause, barbarians. Oh, if the Roman government had at that time had sufficient revenues to maintain an adequate military force, the marauding band of barbarians would not have been able to enter the Italian peninsula, let alone sack Rome. The city of Rome fell because it could not defend itself even against a third-class military force. There was sufficient wealth in the social order to have raised and sustained a strong military force, but such a force did not exist because the tax evaders had all the money. And right, if you're rich, if you're a small rich landowning, small rich class who own most of everything, then you must spend monies in order to maintain that position. If you are Rome, right, you must spend armies to maintain an army. Which means, in effect, that the rich must pay taxes, or the rich must be a king. Either way, the rich have to organize in such a way that they pool their monies together, or one person is so rich that he or she by themselves can equip an entire army. That is, pay other people money. That is, have wage slaves. And then you run into the problem of, how do I get people to work as soldiers when they could be doing their old jobs? Because soldiers require training. You can raise a force of peasants, right? You can call up your workers and say, look, everybody, here's the spear, go to the gate, the Gauls are attacking. But that is a fourth-rate military force. That is a bunch of untrained, easily scattered, unled peasants. You need soldiers who are trained and out-equipped, and that costs money. You need information about who you are fighting. This is you need a government of some sort, and just to defend yourself, which means you have to pay taxes, which means that you need to either have a great many loyal people who are very loyal to you, who are willing to sacrifice their time and effort to be soldiers for your cause, or you need to spend monies on these folk, and with like a class of soldiers and whatnot, which is exactly what happened in the feudal system. So again, I think he has a very good point here. If you are a country that has a very small group of rich people who own almost everything, and everyone else works either as a literal slave, as a peasant, as a serf, or just as a wage slave in the modern world, then the entire system is easily amenable to collapse. Because again, you need rich people who have a long-term view, who are willing to contribute to the common defense, who do not just take their monies and run. I put all the gold in my house on a ship. I'm going to Egypt. I'll be a king there. Or put all the gold in my house on a ship. I'm going to Spain and I'm gonna take over a town there. I'm gonna buy a villa somewhere. And what can also happen is you say, hey, the other people around me aren't raising for the common defense. So what I need to do here is either take over the entire country, become a king, or I need to raise my own army so that I'll look prickly enough that when the Vandals come to the gates of Rome, they don't want to tangle with me. They don't want to tangle with my townhouse. They don't want to tangle with my farm because there's much easier prey. And again, you end up with a feudal system. So how do you avoid a feudal system? You have to have a more equitable distribution of wealth. And for me, at least, this is the answer to the problem raised by Marx, that capitalist systems are doomed to collapse. I do not think capitalist systems are doomed to collapse, but I do think capitalist systems have a tendency to concentrate wealth into fewer and fewer hands. And I think democratic systems have a tendency to become captured by small vested interests. So we need to, in order so that we do not become the next Rome, we ought to keep an eye on the tax system and the political system and the economic balance of our nation, or else the nation will fall apart. It will not happen in a day, it will not happen in a year, but in a decade, in a century, yes, the world we live in will follow Rome in exact and terrible fashion, I think. And whether our new overlords are the people who own the companies, or the people who own the land, or the people who own the guns, or the people who own the farms, or the folk who own the water systems and the electrical systems, that is going to happen unless we take steps to push back against these tendencies of our systems. And to take steps to push back, you have to have, I would argue, you want to have progressive taxes. You want to have open information. And you want to have a level of wealth concentration you do not allow your society to get past, because you end up doing the feudal system in one way or another, whether it's by company or divine decree. That is, capitalism needs to be managed in order to be sustainable, is what I would argue for the United States of America. So, communism and socialism have their problems as well. They have tendencies in their system which need to be looked at very carefully. I think the examples we know so far is that communism, pure communism, tends to have very low production growth and tends to invite a lot of graft and theft in the system, tends to be very secretive. And these actions have negative effects eventually, because you are solving the problems of yesterday and thereby creating the new problems of tomorrow. And this is always the case in any system or any government, as far as I can determine. This is almost always the case for any person, I'd say. I mean, how many times have we decided, I'm going to do this, and it turns out, well, me doing that had other effects. And sometimes those effects are good, but they can also be bad. And how do we make sure to remove the bad effects of our systems while still pushing the good effects of our systems? First, we have to recognize the flaws. We have to be open and understandable about the effects that our system has, and see how we can manage and balance those. And this is the case for any political or taxation system, any economic system, any organization, as far as I can tell. So there were attempts in Rome to push back on this. He says, to check the flight of small landowners, the Roman government passed laws prohibiting the merger of small farms into larger estates. But big landowners had no trouble avoiding this law by bribes and an assortment of legal tricks. If nothing else, big landowners could purchase small farms at forced tax sales, or simply offer to pay any delinquent taxes to the government if a merger were legitimized. Large landowners evaded their taxes through a variety of legal and illegal devices. Bribery was used to obtain low assessments. That sounds familiar to things I've heard in the news. Most important were tax amnesties. Shortly before the fall, tax amnesties were granted for the years 401, 411, 434, 445, 450, and 458. These amnesties were highlighted by public burnings, such as, "We command that the documents of superfluous tax assessments be burned," or "in order that the very memory of delinquent taxes may perish from the earth." Amnesties usually covered accumulated delinquencies. Big landowners would simply stall the tax collector and use their influence to lobby another amnesty through the Senate. At the same time, the gleba, or tax on senators, was abolished along with sales tax and inheritance taxes. Lobbyists for tax avoidance were hard at work tearing down the revenue system. You have the money, you have the influence. Doesn't matter what the law is, you can get it changed. I think about it just in literally in the United States within this year. How many companies and people, I wonder, upon in November realizing that the Republicans were going to control the House and Senate, decided to change their taxes allowances around so that they would take a bigger loss at the quarter at the end of the year, and have a bigger income at a quarter later in the year. Because what did the Republicans do? They passed a change in the tax system, which was beneficial for large companies and for people and for the ultra rich. So now by spending money to push a political party, that political party gets in power and then rewards you by passing lower taxes. It's scary to read about. It is frightening to read about this information regarding Rome and then see it quite literally play out in my own country this exact year. I'm not talking about who was elected, good and bad, and the culture wars. This is pure 100% taxes, economics. This is nothing to do with right and wrong, good and bad. This has to do with who pays less money to the government. And if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. It's worrisome. It's frightening. Right, as might be expected, the great race to evade taxes brought an end to the liturgy. The rich no longer shared their wealth with the community. The process of redistribution of wealth reversed itself. Furthermore, the race and struggle for tax evasion produced a class of corrupt senators whose wealth was based on their ability to abuse the tax system and corrupt public officials. This was not the wealth of energetic and creative entrepreneurs who were skilled in commerce and agriculture, but rather the wealth of men skilled in bribery, fraud, and political manipulations. If you can make more money for your company by knowing the right people to bribe, or by having political influence on Capitol Hill, then your company is going to be led by someone who is not a business person, not an engineer, not someone looking to make more money by coming up with new ideas. No, he's going to do his job and go to Capitol Hill and talk to the right people and get you your money that way, because that's his skill. And that's what he was hired to do. So at the very least, the tax system we want to have is one which is not regressive, is one which is not overly influenced by the politics of the moment. It is one which is not overly harsh on those who have no money to pay. It is one which is not easily manipulated. It doesn't involve a whole lot of tax loopholes. That if you are avoiding tax through legal means, then that tax avoidance should be to such a level that you pay at least a minimum tax, no matter how many avoidances you take. Or you have it such that the avoidances you take involve you spending money on different things, right? Like if you have a tax avoidance scheme, a tax law that says, you can take off this much money from your taxes if you give that money to charity. And this charity needs to do a public service. This charity needs to help feed people, or help maintain roads, or help maintain museums, right? It needs to do a public or help maintain the radio system, or involve, or you need to give that money to PBS or something, right? Then you simply say, you can have a tax avoidance. You don't have to pay this tax directly to the government, but you have to pay that tax to somebody for something. You can't pay a lower effective tax rate than those who are poorer than you, and at any point, or for any reason, right? You can reinvest in your company, but that investment needs to result in taxes being charged, because your company is now better off and richer at some point. And this means that you can only carry losses forward so far, right? Like if you have a company that doesn't pay taxes because through these tax schemes, and they are deferring tax and deferring tax and deferring tax, then there needs to be a very clear limit on when you cannot when you can't hold that tax back any longer. There needs to be the taxes owed under old tax laws, and like a new tax law is being passed cannot affect those tax withholdings. Cannot affect how much you owe under these old taxes. You're only withholding tax from the government for so long before you have to pay it, and you can't. We don't want a system where you can withhold that tax and then lobby the government to change tax law so that you no longer have to pay that tax you're withholding. Right? Because we hear about this in the news once in a while. So and so paid no taxes for this many years and this many years. So and so paid no taxes, for this reason, and the reason always makes sense. There's always an argument there, but the economic realities of the nation state still hold. That tax needs to be paid eventually, and as long as the tax is not paid, you have regressive taxes on the rich, which concentrate wealth, which have a negative effect upon the social and economic health of the country itself. So I would argue that no matter what withholdings you have, a certain minimum tax is required, no matter what. And then the government if it's cautious, relies only upon that minimum tax. And anything beyond that is a windfall. This requires, of course, a government that controls its own spending, which is a whole another issue itself, right? But a government which spends indiscriminately will eventually either collapse or go so deeply into debt that it is paying that debt for generations, or it will raise taxes on its populace until it destroys its own tax base and it can't raise an army against the barbarians at its gates. Or the barbarians inside its gates, in our case. Is that something I think is interesting to think about? Something I think is interesting to think about. I use the same words over and over again. Interesting to consider. What is the danger to the United States? I don't think there's a country on the planet who would invade us. You have to cross oceans to get here. We have more guns than people. We are a large enough country that it would require a continent to organize themselves in such a way to invade us to that effective level. Right, like China is not invading the United States within the next century. The power required is absurd. You might threaten, Russia might threaten us with nukes, but they're not going to be landing, 5 million troops. Not unless something very, very drastic changes. As I said, you would need a continent united. Like one of the reasons we won World War II was because of Russia. One of the huge major reasons we won World War II was because the Germans spent massive amounts of resources and manpower trying to conquer Russia and failing. Russia sacrificed literally millions of people to stop them. And, this is something I think is not thought of often enough. We think of World War II as something won by the US, but it was won by the Allies. It was won by Britain, suffering under bombs and battles for years. It was won by the French resistance, who rose up again in their own country. It was won by sacrifices of millions on the Eastern Front. And in America, we do a disservice, I think, to other countries by not understanding the complexities involved in waging war across continental divides. So an outside source attacking America, I think, is not likely. And by land, Mexico or Canada aren't going to be marching in anytime soon. By sea, we have the 3 largest air forces on the planet. We have the largest navy on the planet. But by sea is going to be very difficult, for example. And then even if you get here, we have 400 people with a rabid gun culture, right? So America does not have to worry about the barbarians at our gates. The only conceivable danger to the state of the United States of America in the next 100 years that I see is internal dissent. And the most likely cause for internal dissent is economic issues. It's not moral issues. It's not culture wars. It's not red versus blue. No, it is economic issues that are most likely to cause massive societal changes. in my opinion, which is part of the reason I'm reading about taxes here and so on. Okay, no one likes to think we're writing our own obituary when we draft modern tax legislation. If our civilization is to be destroyed, we like to think it will happen Hollywood style, a cataclysmic event like an atomic war, an ecological blunder, or some other dramatic happening. Certainly not something so simple and dull as everyday taxation. But Rome didn't fall in a day. Rome didn't fall in a year. Rome didn't fall in a decade. Rome fell in a century of repeated failures, in a century of refusing to drag herself up from the mud, refusing to fix the problems she had. And when she did decide to fix the problems she moved too late and too weakly. We are at the beginning of the problems Rome has here. And we want to, I hope, act differently. You know, where are the contemporary scholar Salvian of Marseille, France, wrote in AD 4040. He's noted that at the time the treasury of Rome was bare. Where are the riches of Rome? The imperial finances are in a state of indigence, and the treasury reduced to misery. Rome had no money. In the same way, we look at the United States and we are in massive debt. It's not debt which is unmanageable. It's not debt we can't deal with, but if it keeps growing and growing and growing, eventually it will be a problem. And I know I've heard this for literally my entire life. The debt problem, the debt ceiling, it's an issue. But the day will come when it is a major issue. And there will be some pressure. Interior pressure, outside pressure, ecological pressure, who knows? And how are we going to react to it? If we react as a nation, then we have a chance of standing up to anything. But if we react as individuals all out to get their own little slice of the pie, then we'll be dragged apart by the wolves one by one and eaten and destroyed as those who can flee our shores do so, and those who cannot flee our shores either die or become slaves and peasants under some autocratic rule or some company system. The United States of America was created in its very first years with the understanding that the Roman Republic fell. There's a reason we have an eagle holding arrows There's a reason that the Freemasons were important. There's a reason we use Corinthian columns in much of our national construction, because it's this memory of Greece and memory of Rome, memory of the classical age, which our founders remembered. And they tried to push the Greek idea with democracy and reason and freedom. And they tried to fix some of the problems of Rome by giving rights to the individual which could not be taken away, by instituting a democratic system so that you didn't have that was resistant to an emperor ruling, by expanding the vote to such a level that they believed no small group could take over the political power of the country because there were so many diverse viewpoints. And as technology has improved, as communication has improved, the country has shrunk. The number of political voices and different political views in the country has shrunk, which is exactly what happened to Rome. Again, eventually only a few people mattered, only a few people had the influence to change the course of the nation, and everybody else just sort of let it happen because they were getting their slice of the pie, or they were just trying to survive. So this is one of the major questions. Are we the Roman Republic? And if we are the Roman Republic, do we remain the Republic, or do we fall and become the Empire? Which in its turn also fell, and to much, much weaker foes than the Republic ever faced.